Hello, my name's Stuart. I'm curator of the Cromwell Museum in Huntingdon. It's a great pleasure to be with you again. It's been a little while since we've done one of these videos, and this particular video today was actually recorded a few months ago, so I'm just putting an edit on it today with an introduction for you. This is the second of our series of videos relating to Cromwell and his infamous campaign in Ireland in 1649. The part of Cromwell's history which has sort of damned his memory in many people's minds more than anything else. And for this, we're interviewing the Irish writer, author, amateur historian Tom Reilly. Tom has written extensively over the last 20 years or so on his view of Cromwell and Ireland, which is a very unique one as somebody who was born and brought up in the town of Drogheda, which of course is the town which Cromwell is perhaps most famous for storming in September of 1649. Tom has a very different viewpoint to many people in Ireland, though, and thinks that Cromwell's memory has been transduced by many of the things that have been said around him. So it's a really different interview today to get his particular take on it, and something which many people might find quite controversial. Hope you enjoy.
So I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by our friend and writer on this period, enthusiast on all matters Cromwellian, Tom Reilly. Tom, thank you ever so much for giving us up your time this afternoon and joining us.
No problem, Stuart. Very happy to.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to ask the first question here. I mean, given that Cromwell's reputation in Ireland is not a positive one, you know, what's historically, I think Winston Churchill famously referred to as the Curse of Cromwell. In terms of his reputation in Irish history, you know, which some people have said the most hated man in Irish history. What on earth sort of engaged you with his story in the first place, and indeed with being such an enthusiast on this particular period of history?
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. There is a book, you probably know about the book. It's called The Most Hated Man in Ireland. And it's about our friend. And
we actually have a copy on display. Actually, we made that point. And actually, the book is actually, because it's a children's book, it's actually much more nuanced than actually the title would give it.
Yeah, it's certainly nuanced, but it's also aimed at children, which is significant, even if you just take the title alone. But it is a fact; you can't deny that. Yeah, I do. I sometimes think, you know, because I'm so deep into this, I'm about 25, 30 years into it. Like my first book came out in 1993. It was a basic enough book called Cromwell at Drogheda, but it was my first introduction. So I often think that, you know, I'm committing some sort of treason, or, you know, being anti-Irish, or, you know, these kind of things. But it's nothing whatsoever to do with that. Like I first discovered Oliver in probably the mid-70s, when I used to, as we say over here, hang around with a girl where the walls of Drogheda are and where the breach was made. And that was, it made an impact on both of us, actually, because we used to kind of go, oh my God, look, you know, thousands of people were killed here, and that's mad. And oddly, I have some musket balls, and I have a cannonball.
Right.
Yeah, we're both. I've got about 17 musket balls, and that was such a thrill finding those, because I went with a metal detector, as you're not supposed to do because it's illegal. And but this isn't going to be heard by too many people in Ireland, so. Well, what do I know? So yeah, I have artifacts like that, but, you know, that area kind of reeked of atmosphere, and it reeked of something having happened there. Obviously in my head, because it's just walls, but they're still there. I mean, where the breach was made, the walls are still there, which is really incredible so many years later, 370 odd years later.
So we're just for many of our audience who kind of aren't as familiar with this, so we're talking here about the town of Drogheda, which is probably the most notorious of all the sieges in Cromwell's 9-month campaign in Ireland, where, you know, during the course of a night, the casualties are estimated around 3,500, of which the makeup of which we'll come on to in a moment, I've no doubt. But it's, you know, it's one of the bloodiest sieges of the civil wars across Britain and Ireland. And of course, it's the one for which arguably Cromwell has been most gone down in infamy. His memory has been most damned.
Yeah, absolutely. I should have provided the context there. Yeah, and if you Google Drogheda, usually the word Cromwell comes up, and if you Google Cromwell, usually the word Drogheda comes up. It's just one of those things. He'll be forever associated with the town. So yeah, and even, you know, as you mentioned there, you know, the fact that I'm Irish, I'm also from Drogheda. So, but none of those things are really that relevant. What I am primarily is cynical. And, you know, when I decided to look just casually in the first instance, because I had notions about writing an article for the local historical society about the events. So I hightailed it up to the local corporation offices to see what they had, and the book of minutes from the corporation meetings exist, and they only go back as far as 1649 because the previous records were burned in the sack. So, but lo and behold, despite being told at school, and despite you know, all of the traditions that people hold dear, there were lots of people alive, hundreds, if not thousands, of people alive, and you know, they suddenly didn't manifest out of nowhere. They existed. So I thought to myself, I'm just going to read you. I'm just going to look off camera for a second, like. Even today, and even in school books today, the expressions that are used, which I would have experienced at school, anybody who experienced the Irish educational system would be taught these things. In Earthlink, this is for 5th class, there's a line that says, Cromwell captured Drogheda, about 3,000 men, women and children were killed. There's not a lot of ambiguity in there. It doesn't leave any room for, you know, speculation. Then you have another one that's called Timeline, and that was published in 2008. And this paragraph is wonderful, and it says, Cromwell first laid siege to Drogheda. He was determined to make an example of the town, and when he captured it, he slaughtered the entire population. Now they're, you know, very, you know, explosive expressions. Yeah. And this is the kind of thing that I would have been taught. So I couldn't understand how all these people were still alive. And then, to make a very long story much shorter, as I began to explore and look at all the evidence and so many other things which we'll talk about shortly, the whole thing began to unravel. And I began to realize, well, that, you know, maybe it wasn't the entire population, maybe it wasn't thousands, maybe it wasn't hundreds. And from there, my cynicism was fed beautifully by the facts as opposed to the verdict of history.
I mean, one of the kind of the most disputed aspects of all of this, and probably obviously for obvious reasons, the most emotive one is the issue of civilian casualties. You know, no doubt that, you know, Drogheda, by, as I say, by any of the standards of the sieges of the civil wars in Britain and Ireland, was extremely bloody. But, you know, the question is over how much of that were kind of, in inverted commas, military casualties. And then this sort of like issue of sort of disputed number of civilians and what we term by that terms of civilians. I mean, most historians sort of tend to work on the basis of, you know, probably some of the accounts, things like Hugh Peter, for example, who wasn't there, but his accounts from the burials, this figure that's often quoted of about 2,800 men, and therefore, you know, are military burials. And then there's this gap there of about 700 that everybody therefore assumes are civilians. And, you know, what do we define as this? I mean, I know you could contend that actually that number is exaggerated, and that many of the sort of the people we think of as civilians actually probably weren't.
Well, there's so many things flying through my head with everything you've said there, Stuart, and I love it. I love that you go straight in, straight away. Let's ask the killer question. Simply, you know, my thesis, my books, I've written 4 books now on Cromwell. I've been responsible for 5. I might come to 1 or 2 of those shortly, but it's a very simple thesis, and it's simply that there was no wholesale, indiscriminate slaughter of men, women and children who were ordinary, who were not in the military, and who had no part, act or hand in the conflict. So that's what I'm saying, essentially, that didn't happen. Now, as you alluded to there, and I understand how academics can, I'm just going to use the expression number juggle. I mean, if we are down to the stage where we're talking about, you know, the difference between what Hugh Peter says, was Cromwell's chaplain. He ended up in Ireland, yeah, but he mentions a figure in a leaflet that's been printed in 1649. So that's a figure, but there are lots of figures. You know, Cromwell mentions a figure. Ormond mentions figures. There are other participants who use figures. So I'm not exactly sure why Hugh Peters's figures are taken as sacrosanct. But irrespective of the figures, if that's the argument now, then why are we teaching children this stuff? Then why has the tradition for centuries been that thousands of men, women, and children who are unarmed and innocent, why were they killed? Like, one of the things that if one is new to this and one is watching this and saying, oh my God, what's this guy on about? Like, it might surprise people to realize that there are no eyewitness attestations whatsoever of details of civilian deaths, not just at Drogheda, but also at Wexford. That's a fact. And that means basically that everybody, and this isn't that long ago, you know, we're not talking about thousands of years when people were illiterate and didn't write. People wrote very well. Printing presses were up and running, and they could basically say what they wanted. So,
I mean, estimates are in many towns and cities across Britain and Ireland that, you know, maybe a third of the population was literate at this time. So, you know, it's sort of, certainly in urban populations where people, you know, there were those documents were circulating much more and educational standards were better.
Absolutely, and that's a key factor. And, like, you know, if even just some of the major participants, we talk about Lord Ormond, who was Cromwell's chief adversary in Ireland and who was leading the charge against him. He never says anything whatsoever about civilian deaths. There was a vicar in the town who was literate and wrote voraciously about the siege of 1641, which also had an impact on 1649. And there was Lord Inchiquin, Murragh O'Brien, who wrote as well at the time. Again, private letters. You know, as you say, people who weren't even involved in any of this could have written anything. So, you know, there's none of that, is my point. None of the people who wrote them said anything about civilian deaths. And not only is it not written down, but it doesn't make any sense. Because when Cromwell arrived in Ireland on the 15th of August 1649, during that week assembling his troops at Dublin, he issued a decree, and it's very clear that his soldiers were not to harm any persons whatsoever unless they be in arms or office with the enemy. I'm not paraphrasing, that's what he said. So the orders were very clear, the evidence is lacking, and there are so many other aspects of it too, because Ormond was no fool. He understood that sieges took time. Cromwell hated sieges, didn't want to prolong anything.
He's a cavalry commander. He's not interested in sieges, and he has a form on this all the way through, be it, you know, Basing House, even back to Burghley House in 43. You know, his attitude is very much, you know, I'll offer them good terms or blow them away if they don't, because I really haven't got time for this. It's not his interest, is it?
Absolutely no. And what he does best is you know, on the battlefield when troops attack and they rally and they attack again. They don't dissipate, like, you know, the famous incident with Prince Rupert at Edgehill. That's not something, you know, Cromwell understood that the three rules you have to have in battle are discipline, discipline, and discipline. You know, and that's what made him so successful, as well as, I imagine, quite an amount of luck. I don't know what part thought had to play in it, but that's entirely a different scenario. So when you think about the siege itself, context is everything. So if you look at the 1641 situation where Drogheda was actually besieged by the Irish, and again, if you're looking at this going, how, you see, you know, Drogheda was in the Pale. The Pale was the English part of Ireland, and Dublin was in the Pale. So yeah, you had literally a box where it was the English administration. Drogheda held parliaments like Dublin did. It was essentially a mirror town of Dublin. It wasn't a quintessential Irish town by any manner of means. So for that siege, the population were confined to quarters. They couldn't leave, obviously, the town, and for 5 months, they couldn't get supplies in. So they ended up eating rats, horse meat, whatever they could find, until eventually a ship broke the boon that was on the river, came in with food, and the siege was lifted. But now, 8 years later, there's another siege looming. So Ormond had placed victuals for 9 months in Drogheda to feed his 3,000 soldiers, not to feed the civilians. So again, the reason I'm saying all this is because, and there is other corroborating evidence that Dean Nicholas Bernard, who was the vicar of St. Peter's, he sent his wife and children out of the town. So there's no real military sense in having the town full of 3,000 civilians, which was about the size of the population, and 3,000 soldiers. So it's very likely that most of the civilians, inhabitants of the town, weren't even there. There are other, if you don't mind me continuing on a rant.
Yeah, no, by all means.
Thank you. There were other, contemporary evidence that sort of rings totally untrue. And it's the evidence from a guy called Thomas A. Wood. And it's often used as, an eyewitness who says, because Thomas Wood says that he gives details of a lady who was killed by the soldiers for her jewels, and that babies were used as a buckler of defense when they were climbing the stairs in St. Peter's Church. But any examination of that particular evidence, which is the one that I've done a forensic look at that wasn't published until 123 years after the events in 1772. It also went through several hands of people who could easily have altered the text. It comes from Thomas A. Wood's brother's life story, which is rambling, and my point is, it's not what you would call contemporary evidence. If Cromwell was in the dock today, anytime during history, and this evidence was presented, it would be thrown out. It would be totally found innocent, because it's all circumstantial, and it doesn't add up.
I mean, you've obviously dug into this again. I know over the years when you published, obviously, originally, Cromwell, an honourable enemy, and Cromwell was framed. The really interesting new publication that you contributed to, and in fact, I know were instrumental in getting out, is this very, very interesting book, which I'm digging through at the moment, which is a collection of essays at the moment, which is this new perspectives on Cromwell and Ireland. Talk us a little bit through, because I gather this sort of came up with a conversation in a pub somewhere or another in terms of the kind of getting together this amazing team of historians that you've managed to put together for this book.
And I don't even drink.
Must have been one heck of a pub.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm very proud, even though my name isn't on the front. I'm very proud of this book. I couldn't, because I'm not an academic, and we had academic editors, it was much more sensible and prudent and appropriate that their names are on the cover. But it was, I say with all humility, my idea to try and assemble a group of academics to deal with the Ireland issue. I felt that the tide was turning a particular way, that the Cromwell's reputation was being looked at in a less tarnished view. People were beginning to see that maybe he, even in the Cromwellian plantation itself, after the campaign, that maybe he didn't play such an active role as people think he did. It was, we use the expression trying to take the word Cromwell out of the Cromwellian plantation. Now that's a huge deal. And, I often, when I talk about this sort of stuff, I can hear people screaming at either the radio or the screen and so on. Oh my God, of course he did, and of course he was. But you have to immerse yourself in this period early to begin to understand so many aspects of it. So while this book deals with, it's an eclectic group of academics, which is fantastic. But yeah, the pub story is, from time to time over the years, I would often try and get people on board. I've asked people so many times, and because maybe I'm a bit of a loose cannon, and I play the role well, I like to be a loose cannon and a passionate one. People took a wide berth, but eventually Professor Martin Bennett from Nottingham Trent University responded to me and said, "Do you know what, we could do this." So I got on a plane, I flew over, we went to Reilly, we went into Cromwell's house, we voted him to be a hero as opposed to a villain, because you can do that now.
Yes, our friends there do that particular poll, so yeah.
Yes. We had lunch and we had some drinks. Mine were all non-alcoholic, and we decided, look, let's give it a go. So we came back, and again, not to inflate my role, because it's quite clear, with the exception of one, I managed to inveigle, with Martin Bennett on board then, all the others to come on board. And I was thrilled. I mean, some of them, in my opinion, are household names in this business. And I was very humbled by those who agreed to come on board. So we have exceptionally good essays in there. They don't all agree with me, which is perfectly fine and balanced, because that's just the way life is.
No, absolutely. I mean, what's interesting is, whilst there is a sort of, I think, a much more nuanced approach than, as you say, going back to sort of some of the sources you quoted earlier on, of the sort of, Cromwell is the Antichrist, as it were. This is a sort of, there are lots of different voices inside here in terms of, what he did or didn't do and so on. But it's a much more nuanced approach and a much more holistic approach, which I really, so far of reading through it, I'm really enjoying.
Yeah, and that's a key aspect to it, because it may take another, I think it's about 300, and my maths are very bad, 1649, 2021, I've got nothing, I can't come up with it now, but it may take another 380 years for the idea that Cromwell didn't play such a huge role in this terrible time in Ireland's history, but it has to happen, in my opinion. And just on that, and this is to do with the change in tide. Because these issues, while they're lovely to talk about, and it's history and it's engaging, and anybody who's interested in history will enjoy the conversations, but it's also very tinderboxy and volatile when you talk about Ireland and Cromwell, because that's kind of huge over here, because we don't just record our history, we are inspired by our history. And in the past, and even into recent times, Cromwell has been used to justify atrocities. And I'm aware, because I live here, and I understand, the demographic and what people think, and anti-English feeling is often just simmering below the surface, and it just might take something very minor to uncage that beast. So while this crusade of mine, and it's not just mine, is ongoing, I genuinely believe that Cromwell has been the subject of a historical miscarriage of justice, and his name needs to be cleared, and basically so we can blame the people who actually were responsible. His role is
as always, it's more complicated, isn't it? And there is a whole legacy of, a tragic legacy of British imperialism, English imperialism, really, I suppose you could say, in many parts of the world, and Ireland is sort of a particular close example of that, not just in terms of geographic locality, but actually compared to many places, a much longer one, and in many respects more tragic one.
Absolutely, and we get taught that. I mean, there was a guy called Eamon de Valera who fought in the 1916 Rising, and he ended up being very instrumental in what kids were taught, through the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and we joke about de Valera's Ireland now because we were given a very tainted view of what history was, but it was also a very biased view, and it was a particularly anti-English view. So
is that part of kind of, I suppose, building a national identity for what effectively was becoming a new independent country again? It's sort of kind of part of the nation building, is the fact that you kind of, you construct a sort of almost a national identity partly from history, and good and bad, and sometimes therefore putting a particular spin. It is part of the problem perhaps here. I mean, I think what we've discussed before is sort of, it's all context is all. and actually, by modern standards, wherever you come on the spectrum in terms of Cromwell in Ireland, by modern standards, it's extremely brutal. But having said that, in the context of, then 150 years, 200 years of brutality with the whole plantation settlements going back to the Tudor period, actually it suddenly then becomes much clearer within a wider story, as it were. And actually it's part of the problem. We tend to just sort of pick on, the tradition tends to just pick on Cromwell and ignore the background in terms of what was going on and been a legacy of that for a century and more.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, actually. And the spin you talk about is just, it changes through the decades, and as people become more suspicious and more cynical, they might not just take for granted what they've been taught and what they've researched. But the bogeyman that is Cromwell is so much easier to dip into history and take him from. But there are a lot of English commanders who should have this title of, the epitome of English oppression, as opposed to Cromwell. I suppose that's my point. I like what you say, and I agree, and I'm exceptionally nationalistic. I mean, I sing my national anthem in my native tongue, and I understand all of the words.
I won't ask you to give your rendition now. So.
Yeah. Don't drink, don't sing. I sing badly, but no, I totally agree. I mean, there are so many things that you could say about Cromwell, and one of the things that always gets thrown at me, of course, the banned Christmas thing. I'm fed up with talking about that.
That's my daily bread and butter. That is.
Of course it is, yeah. But it's the other allegation that he hated Catholics, and that's fait accompli. People just say that and leave it there. But it's so much more complicated than that. I mean, firstly, that's actually probably not a true statement, although I didn't know him. But from the evidence that I've read and understand is that he had a problem with the hierarchy in the Catholic faith. And the generations, and this is unarguable, against of tyranny and oppression and the millions of deaths that the Catholic Church was responsible for, and the Inquisitions, and you just have to think of the Cathars down in the south of France, and so many. I mean, that's their facts. So Cromwell would have grown up knowing all about this stuff. It's not like he didn't have history classes. He did.
Well, I mean, in his sense, it wasn't really history in a way, really, because bear in mind, he'd have known people who were probably in his childhood who were still alive when Mary Tudor was on the throne and there was the last Catholic oppression. He was at schoolboy. He was 6 years old when the Gunpowder Plot happened.
Yes.
When, of course, there was obviously a wide sort of suspicion and of horror. Nowadays in Britain, we tend to think of it as a bit of a party and an excuse for a few fireworks. But it was a sort of a threatened terrorist atrocity, kind of the 9/11 of the 17th century, if it had worked.
And that Catholics were being blamed for.
Absolutely. Which many of the Catholic population, certainly in England, were appalled by, because, of course, it put them in the firing line, quite literally, by this bunch of extremists. So in the same way as today, unfortunately, the Muslim population gets tarred with the sort of the whole activities of a few extreme terrorists. So the same was the Catholic community in the early 17th century in England, and indeed by implication in Ireland as well.
Exactly, and if you extend that even a bit more, and but the problem with anyone who's been either lived in Ireland for a long time, you understand, or Irish, you understand that we've been a Catholic country for as long as, St. Patrick came over with Christianity in 432, and or at least thousands of years, no, hundreds of years. So the whole idea that we have a persecution complex, and that's a lot to do with what's going on, because when you look at from this distance, if you look back at what Cromwell did, everybody goes, Catholics equals good, Protestants equals bad. So they were bad, we were good. English equals bad, Irish equals good. I mean, that's not really that relevant. But unfortunately, it inflames hearts even still, because Cromwell had an issue, and the issue was that as far as he was concerned, let's say the 1641 rebellion was, encouraged from the pulpit by Catholic priests, and there's evidence for that. So, he, as a Puritan, didn't need priests. He didn't need bishops. He didn't need cardinals. I don't even know what comes next. He didn't need archdeacons or popes. His relationship with God was direct. So you can see, and even as somebody who's non-religious, I'm completely non-religious. I would side more on from his point of view than a man-made hierarchy that can cause a lot of issues. So he, even as protector, Catholics weren't oppressed throughout England. And he's also alleged to have been friendly with some Catholics. And throughout Ireland, one of the main things that when he was here, he wrote about 40 documents. He never uses the word Catholic at all. He doesn't, the war, as far as he was concerned, the conflict that he was involved in was a royalist versus parliamentarian war. That is very clear. Yes, there were occasions when the religion, created the circumstances for somebody to take a side. But, even in Drogheda, there were Protestant royalists and there were Catholic royalists. So it's not as simple as it might seem looking back. And again, Cromwell's attitude to ordinary people was that he would meddle not with any man's conscience. Women didn't have a conscience, of course, back in the 17th century. That was just the way it was, ridiculously at times, but we can't judge. But, so, and throughout his life, and as we know, as Lord Protector, he was really lenient towards other religions and fostered a religious liberty policy. Let the Jews back into England. He was, even though the Quakers and the Anabaptists were a threat, he was quite lenient towards them.
Absolutely, yes. It seems to be, the idea of freedom of conscience seems to be very close to his heart. So, yes, it's an interesting one. Whilst he seems to have regarded the Catholic Church as an evil institution, as you say, he seems to have had very little problem with individual Catholics and even some friends like Kenelm Digby. So, he's a fascinating character in his own right.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned obviously digging down into kind of Cromwell's psychology, and you've gone a little bit further than that recently just by writing a novel about him, which is must be a shift over from writing history books. And it's interesting talking to a number of people we've done in these videos, people like Miranda Malins, for example, historians who've now transported over into sort of writing, trying to reflect the history through fiction, but with very closely researched fiction. How was the experience of, whereas Cromwell pops up as a subsidiary character in those novels, you've made him the centre of yours. How was the sort of the experience of bringing kind of Cromwell to life, as it were, in a novel?
Well, in terms of an experience, it was wonderful for me to immerse myself in Cromwell's life, because I find him a fascinating individual. As regarding writing non-fiction and fiction, they're completely different, and I couldn't understand the context for a while. Like, how could I actually make something up? Because you had to fill in a lot of gaps. I call it faction. It's based on his life all the way through, from birth to death and beyond, because we know, eventually there's lots more to the story. But yeah, I found it intriguing because there are lots of gaps, certainly in his early years, that we just don't know anything about. So I was able to let my imagination, the Chief of Sinners comment, for instance, he gave it to me. He said I was the chief of sinners. So I made him into a bit of a sinner, and he's visiting various dens of iniquity and stuff like that, which adds to the story. And to be fair, I didn't really need to add too much to the story, because what have we got? We've got regicide, we've got massacres, we've got somebody who took the throne, the first commoner, the only commoner ever to have ruled England, Ireland, and Scotland. All the ingredients are already there. The battles he won, you know, amazingly, whether or not it was by, you know, guile or luck or God. There were so many aspects to his life that I really didn't have to add to. If you just look at his life, you think, oh my God, I'm okay. I used the monkey story.
Yes, but then that's the privilege of a novelist, so, you know, and particularly given the fact that, you know, we know so little about Cromwell's childhood, you know, and there was a reason why later writers and traditions were created, is to create that backstory for him, because very little was known. So why not seize on it, I suppose.
I did what every writer would probably do, is go to the sexy parts, to the parts that you know, just are a bit of a hoot, as we say over here, just to make it interesting, you know, because there are, you know, there are allegations that he, by the royalists, and contemporary allegations that he sexually assaulted women on the streets. So I developed that a bit, you know, because if he was the chief of sinners and that's the kind of thing that he did, who knows? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. So yeah, there's lots in there. I found it a fascinating book to write. It just poured out of me, because you know, this character, while in Ireland, as I've said before, like, it's the same as using the word Hitler or Pol Pot or Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden. It's the same ring. You know, and I know you, as a curator of the Cromwell Museum, have experienced activity from people with Irish roots who really should know better.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that's evolved over the last few years. Actually, I think people because people realise we try and, you know, tell his story fairly, but also honestly. And as we say, you know, the man himself invented this wonderful phrase, "warts and all," allegedly. So, you know, I try to do that, and we, you know, we don't sort of shy away from trying to tell that sort of story. I think there is genuinely, I think people are becoming much more open, and we get quite a lot of Irish visitors, and a lot of people from Ireland follow us on social media. And we obviously, you know, correspond with Irish academics and with authors like yourself. So it's interesting. There seems to be a lot more openness to it now than, talking to my predecessor, John Goldsmith, you know, than probably there was, say, 20 years ago, where there was very much of a nervousness, I think, about, you know, even mentioning Cromwell's name, where there was an Irish context to it.
I know. I mean, when I joined the Cromwell Association, which I was accused of in my local newspaper, it's like I've joined the Hitler Association, you know, and there's such a connotation to that. It's just a local historical association. And when well, not so much local, but it's a historical association. And when I came to England in the beginning, and, you know, rattled a few cages and made a few statements and then departed the scene, I know people are kind of going, was he Irish? What was he saying exactly? You know, and I like to think that my books have, you know, made a positive impression on this whole debacle, this whole terrible time. And it was a terrible time. I mean, I'm not suggesting for a second that you know, that the 17th century was in any way
not pleasant.
No, you know, Protestant ascendancy and all the things that came out of that, and history went in a particular direction, and Catholicism was, you know, downtrodden, and the Irish were downtrodden, and, you know, I mean, this is something that happened. I'm just simply saying that civilians weren't massacred left, right, and centre. But, you know, other aspects of this are, you know, at that time, like for 11 years, there were no allegations from anybody of any significance that civilians were killed at Drogheda, apart from two royalist hacks who decide to, you know, print whatever they wanted to say, but without any foundation. You know, they made, most of their stuff was just calumny and lies. So again, but for the context and for everybody to understand, like, it was when the Restoration, and that's the return of Charles II on his birthday to the royal throne in 1660, that's more or less when the winners decided to rewrite history, and they wanted to totally wipe the Republic off the face of the earth, and made a good go of it. Now, ironically, that's the period much more popular for students of the 17th century to go into the Republic, as opposed to the Charles II nonsense. He was more interested in things carnal, I think, than he was in anything else.
Yeah, well, yes, I mean, people, it certainly seems to be a super successful period for novelists, again, with all the kind of body stripping and so on. So, which is, I mean, talking of which, I mean, actually, I mean, again, going back to your kind of your novel side of things, or whatever else, I mean, how do you kind of make Cromwell as a sort of a sort of living, breathing person, and yeah, you know that there is a sex scene at least inside there as well. You know that's a mind-boggling thought when you think of that iconic statue of Cromwell outside the Houses of Parliament. That's how most people think of him, as this kind of almost you know, a figure that is a sort of statue, as it were.
Imperial, yeah.
Yeah, and then sort of trying to put a human face and write that sort of thing out of it. That must be quite a mind-boggling concept.
It was so easy, Stuart. I can tell you.
I'm not going to ask whether you did research for it. Okay.
Well, in fairness, he was a man, and he had 9 children, so he knew how to do stuff. So. Yeah. You just sort of extrapolate that out, and you think, okay, well, let's just, it's very seldom, if ever, that Cromwell would ever have been associated with sex. So, and sex in novels, to be fair, is that's what novels are about and can be about. But to make him human and to try and be serious for a second, to try and interpret the man, it was very easy because we have an awful lot of what he said, or what he's alleged to have said. There are, letters in different volumes throughout the centuries that he wrote himself, that we know he wrote. Other letters that are speeches that somebody wrote and dictated that he had said. So there's an awful lot. So I tried at all times, and this is one of the key aspects of this novel, is I tried at all times to be true to the man, and I tried to reflect. Because it's all, the language is 17th century language, obviously, it has to resonate of that period. So I used, in as much as I could, words that he actually used himself. So he gave me his personality, and he gave me every aspect of his life that I took and put into this book. But it was very easy, and again, if you're Irish and you're looking at this, you're going, "Oh my God, that's a dreadful thing to do." It's not. I mean, I see this as a positive. I see this as a redressing of the balance. I see this as my contribution to the Good Friday Agreement. When I shake off this mortal coil, I'll be, known for having made, in my opinion, as the years pass, hopefully, that guy who maybe righted or wrong, because I just believe this is a wrong, because this Cromwell, in my opinion, was fundamentally a good man. He was a reluctant overachiever. You can discuss that till the cows come home. That's what I believe, because that's the Cromwell I found. And I found that because I'm allowed to find that, because that's my interpretation of the facts. And it's very hard to see this allegation that's often thrown at him as being a military dictator. He didn't want the role. He wanted the role to be temporary as Lord Protector. And he stood into the gap, as he says, and found himself, in control of the army and basically ruling, okay, with a Council of State and with a Parliament, the parliaments he fell out with because they didn't agree with him and so on. It was a very convoluted time. Again, as you once said to me, like, context is really everything. To go in and cherry pick facts and make them suit your agenda, it just doesn't work in this 17th century.
And the interesting thing is, of course, it's so subject to many different interpretations, which of course is what makes it so fascinating. And the reason why I think historians continue to chew over and sometimes find new evidence for and new interpretations as to what this period, what happened in this period and what people's motivations are. And it's in those gaps, which obviously you've kind of managed to explore as a novelist, I think, is sort of the interesting bits, as it were, that raise those questions. And I think there's also debate over.
Absolutely.
I have to say, mischievously, I mean, that having read some of the novel and really enjoyed it so far, it does really read like it's a sort of aiming for a Netflix drama. Have you written it with an eye to that?
Yes.
It feels like you've written it to be quite cinematic in certain respects. or at
No
least
question.
I'm thinking HBO series.
Yeah, HBO, Netflix, anybody. I've gone way past the book. As far as I'm concerned, this story needs to be told. And while a book is fine, epicness can only come from the screen. And, irrespective of whether or not people take the slant that I put on Cromwell, his life is such a movie. It's an incredible, what a rags to riches story. As I was writing the book, I know this is going to sound weird, but as I was writing the book, I was thinking, how is somebody not writing this at the same time? We're all in lockdown. I actually had created a race for myself to get there before the person who's also doing it, or the people, because it's beyond belief to me how this hasn't been done before. How has Cromwell's life not been actually documented in fiction form in the past? So, to me, yeah, absolutely. Netflix, HBO, talk to me.
We'll wait the phone call and the deals to come on even now. So, yeah. Tom, it's been absolutely fascinating. I know firstly it's all the Cromwell and Ireland, which I have to say is a bit of a hefty price. I know that's the publisher, not you, but yeah. Fingers crossed there's a paperback of this, so it makes it much more accessible, because I think it should be much more widely read. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon and for joining us. Very much appreciated.
Not at all, Stuart. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Hope you found that interesting. If you do, then please do remember to like and subscribe to this video. We also, of course, have many more videos, and we will try and get more videos out on this channel over the next few months for you on a more regular basis. Thank you very much indeed for watching, and hope to see you again soon.